David Clendon.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make some brief comments in regard to section 41 of the bill that inserts a new part 80, section 80. And the theme of this particular part of the bill is around the decision or not to conduct an inquest into deaths in custody. The current situation, of course, is that it's mandatory. I'm speaking specifically about deaths in prisons, so there are other forms of custody and care, obviously. But the default position at the moment is that the coroner must undertake an inquest when there's a death in one of our prisons. And when the original drafting of the bill came to us and we saw that there would be now a discretion allowed, that was a deal breaker for the Greens, where that was entirely unsatisfactory to us for two reasons, primarily being the wording in the original bill, which said, and I quote, that there would be some discretion. The coroner would have to consider the following: that the dead person was at the time of death a person in official custody, and the negligence or misconduct of a person other than the dead person appears to have contributed to the dead person's death. In effect, that said to us that you had to be proven guilty before there would be an investigation. It suggested almost that a coroner would have to be satisfied that there was something unwholesome in the death, something of concern, before they could conduct an inquest. And that seemed an entirely roundabout way of approaching things. I guess my other general point was that, sadly, in my view, Corrections Department is not an organisation renowned for its transparency. I believe it has a culture that is very inward-looking, very defensive. It is we've seen several inquiries of various forms into deaths in custody where it's been demonstrated beyond doubt that those deaths were preventable, that they were a result of lack of adequate monitoring, lack of appropriate and timely health care. And so for all of those reasons, we are completely opposed to the idea of discretion. Our position has changed now because, in large part, of the submissions we got from the coroners themselves. The Chief Coroner came to the Select Committee, and one of the points she made was that due to some very misguided, I call it, changes to sentencing and other laws, we do now have this phenomenon of many more people growing old in prisons. The general health status of inmates in our prisons, generally they look their health is probably like that of a person 10, 20, 30 years older than their chronological age. As people age in prison, they're susceptible to illness and disease. And the coroner specifically noted examples where a person might be diagnosed with a cancer, they might spend their last year in prison suffering from that terminal condition, and yet at the point of their death, the coroner was obliged to conduct an inquest. I heard similar submissions just informally from meetings with several other coroners, and they were all unanimous in their belief that they ought to have a degree of discretion in these cases. So we've got to the point of being satisfied with that, given the new wording now speaks to the fact that the test, if you like, for coroners was that the death was a death in custody, and the death would not reasonably have been expected by a doctor who had access to the person's health information as defined, etc. That seems to us to be a much more straightforward, a much more sensible solution, where there is a degree of discretion for coroners, where there is, if it's a otherwise apparently fit, healthy person who has died unexpectedly, if somebody, a medical practitioner looking at that person's notes, would not have expected that death, then that is a reasonable base level, we think, for triggering a coroner's inquest. And on that basis, sir, I do think that I think that's come to a good place. In fact, that I've got a great deal of confidence, I'd have to say, in the coroners. I think they are appropriately sceptical in these matters, that they will conduct a fairly rigorous investigation initially, and if they're not entirely satisfied that the death was explainable by for example, a pre-existing health condition, then they will trigger that inquest, and we think that's a better place to be. Inquests are expensive, they demand a great deal of the, not least of all of any family that an inmate or a person in custody might have. They can cause significant delays and upset. So I think that's probably come to a good place. As I say, I must stress that that was based on a number of both formal and informal conversations with coroners who were unanimous in believing that we ought not to have that mandatory provision, and for that reason, sir, the Greens are now supporting this bill.
Jackie